The most famous account of sitting is what came to be known as the Women's War, or the Aba Women's War, ironically again in the same region. The British Empire's pacification of Igbo land was slow, as each community represented its own entirely separate nation, with almost always no central authority onto itself, meaning that the British had to go through hundreds, if not thousands, of communities one by one, as opposed to taking over a few empires or overlapping kingdoms. A process that began arguably in the 1880s, finally ending in the 1920s with the pacification of the last inland Igbo communities into the Nigerian Union of the time. But establishing actual control would prove to be an entirely new and even more complex battle unto itself. Immediately after conquest, the British began implementing a census. Suspicious of the census and guessing that it was a ploy to administer a tax or outright extort wealth from individuals, it was met with stiff resistance. The colonial administration gathered the leading men in the most resistant communities and promised them that there would be no tax and that the census itself was ordinary protocol. Long story short, by 1929, the economies of the Western powers had begun to collapse due to the Great Depression. The British rushed to begin taxing the untaxed portions of its colonies and increasing taxes where they were already being paid. When the British announced another round of census taking, rumors once again began that this was a ploy to implement taxation. To avoid the issues they faced previously, the British appointed locals to do the footwork of census taking and tax collecting. But since the British did not know nor understand how government was done in Igbo land, all agreements and consultations were again done with men. This meant that even in communities who agreed to cooperate with the census and taxation, it was only the men who were bounded to that agreement, as women were left out of the discussion and therefore exempt from its conclusions. To make it worse, women did not pay taxes in ancestral society. One day, a woman by the name of Nwanyeruwa was leaving her market women's meeting when she was approached by a British-appointed tax and census officer by the name of Emereuwa. Emereuwa asked Nwanyeruwa, "Have you counted your livestock?" Insulted, Nwanyeruwa responded, "Have you asked your husbandless mother?" In a fit of anger, the man began choking Nwanyeruwa, leading to a fight between the both of them. The fight brought the attention of the market woman, and once free from his grip, Nwanyeruwa ran back to the meeting to confirm to them that yes, the British were coming with another census, and yes, they were going to tax the women. The women organized and began sitting on the men who collaborated with the British, such as the warrant chief of the community at the time, Chief Okugo. In a matter of hours, thousands of women gathered outside of the home of Chief Okugo, demanding that he resign and stand trial for collaborating with the colonial regime. As tensions rose and the women refused to relent in their protests, the British administration and its security came in, hoping to scatter the demonstrators. The colonial police opened fire on the Ngwa women. But to their surprise, the protests went from sitting to warring. The women began destroying anything that belonged to the British administration, from jails to courthouses, and sending emissaries across the region to spread the rioting and protesting. At its peak, women from Ibibio land in the far southeast, all the way to the Olu zone in central Igbo land, and all of the communities in between were embroiled in a mix of fighting, rioting, and demonstrating. Repeated attempts to stop the women violently were met with increased passion. At the end of the war, the British began a concentrated effort to actually study the role of women in Igbo society. Because of women's refusal, no new taxes were implemented. But seeing how the complexity of government in Igbo society could be a hindrance in the future, the British began a policy of defanging or demoting a lot of the institutions that belonged to women, as to prevent the situation from repeating. Gradually, titles like Olmo in regions that participated in the war were discontinued, and the leaders of men's society, often themselves appointed by the British, were gradually positioned to serve as the apex leaders of the community as a whole, in the creation of a top-down governance structure. But the damage had already been done. Inspired by the events of the Women's War, students and journalists took to protesting across the Nigerian colony and in several other African nations. The press began publishing questions and examinations on the validity of the colonial administration and the colonial experience as a whole. This spark began the independence movement and inspired similar movements all over Africa. Until 30 years after the Women's War, Nigeria achieved independence from British rule. As always, this is Nwanyeruwa, and I want to thank you for watching. Take care.